My name is Renee Beaumont. I am 34 years old, and for 11 years I have been the pharmacist at the Fred Meyer on Redwood Highway in Grants Pass, Oregon. The one who checks your interactions before you ever feel them, who reads the fine print on every bottle so you don't have to, who has learned, more than almost anyone I know, that the truth is usually written down somewhere. You just have to be willing to look. I want to start with the moment none of them expected, the one that happened on a gravel turnoff 11 miles outside of town, with the smell of cedar and river water in the air, and a family of 4 standing in the driveway of a cabin they had paid $410 to spend the weekend in. A cabin that belonged to me. My mother-in-law was standing on the porch in a cardigan the color of dried moss, holding a key ring in one hand and a clipboard in the other, and when she turned and saw my car pull in behind theirs, her face did something I had never seen it do in 9 years of knowing her. It went still, not surprised, caught. There was a family I'd never met standing at the bottom of the porch steps with 2 suitcases and a cooler between them, sunscreen and river water in the air. A strange car with out-of-state plates, parked crooked in the gravel, like it had been pulled in quickly. My daughter Lily was already out of the back seat behind me, running toward the water the way she always does, no idea yet that the ground under all of us was about to shift. But here's what none of them knew. I hadn't come out to that cabin because I was suspicious. I'd come out because I'd already spent 3 weeks quietly requesting records, booking confirmations, a signed lease agreement with a forged signature on the tenant line, and bank deposits going back 24 months, all sitting in a folder in my car, organized the way I organize everything, alphabetically, chronologically, without a single loose page. I hadn't come to ask a question, I'd come to answer one. Welcome back to my channel, where the quietest person in the room always has the longest memory. If you've ever had a family member decide that grief makes property negotiable, drop a comment below and be sure to subscribe. To explain how I ended up standing in a gravel driveway with a folder of 2 years' worth of another woman's secret income, I have to go back to the beginning, back before the cabin, before Geraldine, before David, to a version of my life that still believed families operated the way the label suggested they did. I grew up in Medford, 30 minutes south of where I live now, the only daughter of a machinist father and a mother who kept the books for 3 small businesses in town out of a spare bedroom that smelled permanently of coffee and toner. I was the kid who alphabetized her own bookshelf at 9 years old, who liked numbers because numbers didn't change their mind about you. I went to Oregon State for pharmacy, 6 years of organic chemistry and pharmacology and clinical rotations that had me on my feet 14 hours a day, learning to read handwriting doctors would be embarrassed by, learning the particular quiet horror of catching a mistake before it reaches a patient. I met David Oakes the summer after I finished my licensure exam. He was working construction on a bridge crew outside Grants Pass, tall in that unhurried way some men are, with hands that were always a little rough and a laugh that came late and full, like it had to travel some distance to get to his mouth. He took me to the cabin on our 4th date, a squat, sturdy 2-bedroom place his father, Walter Oakes, had built with his own hands in 1979 on a bend of the Rogue River, all cedar shake siding and a stone chimney. Walter had hauled the rocks for himself, one wheelbarrow at a time. David told me that story on the porch that first night, the smell of cedar and river water thick in the air, a barred owl calling somewhere across the water, and I remember thinking, this is a man who comes from people who build things that last. We married 2 years later at a small ceremony at that same cabin, 40 guests on folding chairs in the yard, my father walking me down a path of river rock. David had laid himself the week before. Walter Oakes died the following spring, a stroke in his sleep, quiet and complete, the way some deaths are almost a mercy. In his will, the cabin passed to David outright, not to Geraldine, not to David's sister Dana, to David, his only son, the one who had spent every summer of his childhood learning to patch a roof and split wood and bleed a water line before the first freeze. David and I added my name to the deed the year after we married, joint tenancy with right of survivorship, the kind of quiet legal housekeeping you do without thinking much about what it means until the day it means everything. I want to be honest about what that cabin became to me. It wasn't a vacation property. It was where David proposed, wading into the river with his jeans rolled up, holding a ring box above his head like an idiot, laughing so hard he nearly dropped it. It was where our daughter Lily took her first unsteady steps on the porch boards, her small hand gripping the railing David had sanded smooth for exactly that purpose. It was where, on a Tuesday in October 3 years ago, I got the phone call that David had collapsed on a job site in Ashland, a cardiac event, the kind that gives you no warning, no chest pain the week before, no reason to have made him see a doctor sooner. He was 41 years old. He was gone before the ambulance reached the hospital. I don't say this to make you feel sorry for me. I say it because I need you to understand what that cabin was before I tell you what my mother-in-law did with it, because the two things only make sense next to each other. I also want to be honest about the sacrifices that came before any of this, because I think people assume a pharmacist's life is tidy, and mine wasn't, not in those years. I took the overnight shift for 2 years running so David and I could bank enough for the down payment on our house in town, coming home at 7 in the morning smelling like hand sanitizer and vending machine coffee, sleeping in 4-hour stretches while David got Lily ready for daycare. When David died, I didn't take more than 9 days off work, because the pharmacy was short-staffed and because, if I'm honest, standing behind that counter counting tablets into amber bottles was the only place my hands still knew how to be steady. My manager at the time, a soft-spoken man named Harold Ito, who'd hired me straight out of licensure, told me I could take a full leave if I needed it. I told him I needed the counting more than I needed the leave. That's not bravery. That's just what grief does to some of us. It makes routine into oxygen. Geraldine Oakes is 67 years old, small and precise, with the kind of Southern Oregon practicality that makes her seem on the surface like the most reliable woman in any room. She taught 4th grade in Grants Pass for 26 years. She organizes the church rummage sale every October at First Baptist on G Street, and she is, by most accounts in this town, a genuinely good neighbor. The kind who shows up with a casserole before you've even called to say you're sick. She was, for the first 6 years I knew her, warm to me in a slightly formal way, the kind of mother-in-law who remembers your coffee order and corrects your casserole seasoning in the same breath, who hugs you a beat too long at holidays and calls it affection. I remember the first Thanksgiving David brought me to Foothill Boulevard. Geraldine had set an extra place at the table without being asked, put a sprig of rosemary on my plate, because David had mentioned once, in passing, that I liked the smell of it, and spent 20 minutes telling me stories about Walter building the cabin, how he'd hauled river rock for the chimney in a wheelbarrow with a bent wheel, how he used to say a house built with your own hands owes you nothing back. I liked her enormously that night. I want that on the record, because I think it matters. This wasn't a woman who arrived in my life already looking for an angle. Something changed in her after Walter died, and it changed further, and worse, after David did. I want to be fair to her, because fairness is something I believe in even now. Geraldine had buried her husband 6 years before she buried her son. She had watched Walter build that cabin board by board across 4 summers when David was a boy, and I think, in some part of her that never got examined out loud, she never fully accepted that it belonged to me and not to her, that when David died, the things she had left of Walter's handiwork, and now of David's, had passed by law to a daughter-in-law rather than back to the family she'd built it inside of. Grief does strange arithmetic sometimes. It tells people that love and ownership are the same ledger, and that the person who is still standing owes something to the ones who are gone. That doesn't excuse what she did, but I think it explains where it started. The first small sign came about 8 months after David's funeral, at a Sunday dinner at Geraldine's house on Foothill Boulevard. I mentioned, in passing, that I hadn't been out to the cabin in a while, that I couldn't quite face the drive yet, the smell of cedar and river water, David's handwriting still on the fuse box where he'd labeled every circuit in blue Sharpie. Geraldine patted my hand and said, "Well, it's not doing anybody any good sitting empty, honey. I check on it." Somebody should. I thought that was kindness. I know now it was the beginning of a cover story. The second sign came about 4 months after that, when Lily, she was 7 then, asked me at breakfast why Grandma Geraldine had new people over at the lake house on their weekend visit. I asked what she meant. Lily said there had been a family there, a mom and dad and a little boy about her age, swimming off the dock, and Grandma had told them to give the family some privacy, and hurried Lily back to the car. I remember standing at the kitchen counter with a coffee mug in my hand, feeling something small and cold move through my chest. The way you feel it when a lab value comes back just slightly outside normal range. Not alarming yet, but noted. Filed. I told myself it was probably a neighbor. Geraldine had mentioned once that people sometimes use the boat launch near the property without asking. I let it go. That's the part I want to be honest about, the part that's hard to admit. I had every reason, right there, to ask one more question, and I didn't. I was still deep enough in grief that keeping the peace felt more survivable than opening a fight I didn't have the strength for yet. The third sign was smaller and stranger. Geraldine started discouraging spontaneous visits to the cabin. "Let me know before you go out there, honey. There's been some issues with the septic," she'd say, or, "The driveway's a mess right now. I had someone out doing gravel work, always some reason, always delivered with a particular brightness Geraldine uses when she wants a subject closed rather than discussed. There was a fourth small sign before the one that finally broke through, and I want to include it because I think it shows how slowly this kind of thing accumulates when you're not looking for it. About a year and a half after David died, I asked Geraldine for the extra key to the cabin so I could have a duplicate cut for Lily, who was starting to ask more often about going back. Geraldine told me she'd misplaced it, that she'd have a new one made and mail it to me. 3 weeks passed, then 5. When I finally asked again, she said she'd found it after all and would drop it by that weekend. She never did. I let it go, the way you let go of 100 small administrative failures from people who are grieving too, telling myself she was scattered, not evasive. I understand now that she was stalling, because the lockbox code she'd installed for renters made a physical key from me, a liability she couldn't risk circulating. The fifth sign was the one that finally reached past the fog of my own grief and lodged itself somewhere I couldn't ignore. It was in June, almost 2 years after David died. I'd started, slowly, trying to reclaim pieces of a life that felt like mine again. Evening walks, a book club at the library on 6th Street, dinner once a month with my old college roommate Jess, who now works as a pharmacy tech 2 counters down from me and has known me since we were 22 years old, sharing a cinder block dorm room that smelled like ramen and Sharpie fumes. Jess and I met the first week of college, 2 18-year-olds assigned to the same cinder block dorm room, and she's the reason I survived organic chemistry, quizzing me on reaction mechanisms at 2 in the morning with a bag of pretzels between us on her bed. She moved back to Grants Pass the same year David and I did, took a job as a pharmacy technician, and has worked 2 counters down from me for 6 years now. She was also the one who sat with me in the break room the week after David's funeral, not saying anything useful, just handing me tissues and refilling my coffee, because she understood that some grief doesn't need words, it just needs somebody in the room. Jess is the kind of friend who tells you the truth even when it costs her something, and one Tuesday over pad thai at the place on 6th Street, she set her fork down and said, "Renee, can I ask you something and you not get mad at me?" I said, "Of course. Is somebody staying out at your cabin?" My cousin Wendy's boyfriend was up fishing the Rogue a couple weekends back, and he said there was a family out on your dock, kids jumping off the end of it, cooler, the whole thing. He figured you'd finally started renting the place, said good for you, extra income and all. I remember the exact sound the ice made in my glass when I set it down too hard. I remember telling Jess I hadn't rented anything to anyone. I remember her face changing, the way a person's face changes when they realize they've handed someone information that's about to detonate something. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because I knew anything yet, because I didn't know anything yet, and not knowing when your instincts are already telling you something is wrong is its own particular kind of insomnia. Around midnight I got up, made tea I didn't drink, and opened my laptop. I told myself I was just going to look. I typed cabin rental Rogue River Grants Pass into a search engine the way you'd pull up a chart before a difficult conversation with a patient. Not to accuse anyone yet, just to see what the record actually said. It took 11 minutes. The listing was on a mid-size vacation rental site, the kind that doesn't require much verification to post a property. Riverside Cedar Retreat, Sleep 6, private dock. The photos were unmistakable. The stone chimney Walter Oakes had built rock by rock. The porch railing David had sanded smooth for a toddler's hand. The kitchen with the same blue and white curtains I'd hung the spring before David died. The same cast iron skillet still hanging by the stove, because I hadn't been able to bring myself to remove a single thing from that kitchen. Whoever had staged those photos hadn't redecorated. They'd simply pointed a camera at my life and called it a rental unit. The listing had 83 reviews going back nearly 2 years. The host account was under the name G. Oakes Property Management. I sat at my kitchen table until 4 in the morning that night, reading every review. Families thanking the host for a wonderful weekend. A note about how helpful Geraldine had been coordinating the key lockbox. A 5-star review from a family in Sacramento who'd stayed there just 3 weeks earlier, praising the peaceful dock where their son had caught his first fish. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it wasn't dramatic and it wasn't immediate, and I think that surprises people. I didn't call Geraldine that night. I didn't confront her the next morning. I closed the laptop, went to work at 6 a.m. like I always do, counted out 140 tablets of metformin for a woman named Terrell Jensen who's been my regular for 6 years, and I did not say one word to anyone about what I'd found. Because here's the thing about being a pharmacist for 11 years. You learn that the moment you find a discrepancy is never the moment to act on it. It's the moment to document it. If you've ever found out a family member was quietly profiting off something that used to belong to someone you loved, tell me in the comments, because I want you to know you're not the only one who sat very still for a while before doing anything at all. The next morning, I called Dan Alcott. Dan has practiced law out of a converted craftsman on G Street in Grants Pass for almost 30 years. Mostly wills, property disputes, small business contracts, the unglamorous work that keeps a small town's paperwork honest. He's in his early 60s, built thin and weathered the way men get who spend their weekends fixing fences instead of golfing. And he wears a barn coat over his suit jacket most of the year and still drives the same faded green Ford pickup he had when he handled David's and my closing on a second small property we bought together the year before David died. Dan had also, quietly and without making a production of it, helped me file David's will through probate, sitting with me in the same office while I signed page after page with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. He knew, better than almost anyone outside my own family, exactly what I owned and exactly how I owned it. I sat across from him in his office, which always smells faintly of old paper and the radiator heat that never quite turns off even in June, and I put my laptop on his desk and showed him the listing. Dan is not a man who reacts quickly. He read every review. He zoomed in on 3 of the photos. He was quiet long enough that I could hear the clock on his bookshelf ticking. "That's your cabin," he finally said. Not a question. "That's my cabin," I said. "Solely mine. Since David's death, under the right of survivorship on the deed you filed." Dan took his glasses off and cleaned them on his shirt, which is a thing he does when he's deciding how bluntly to speak. "Renee, I need you to understand something before we go any further. If someone has been collecting rental income on a property they don't own, and doing it under a name that implies management authority they don't have, that's not a family disagreement. That's conversion, at minimum, possibly larger, depending on what else we find. I want you to let me pull this the right way before anybody says a word to anybody. Can you sit with that for a while?" I told him I could. I want to be honest. Sitting with it was harder than I let on. There was a night, about a week into the process, when I sat in David's old recliner with Lily and Sam already asleep down the hall, and I almost called Geraldine anyway, just to hear what she'd say, just to get it over with. I had the phone in my hand. I got as far as pulling up her contact. And then I thought about the 83 reviews, about 2 years of family swimming off David's dock while I stayed away out of respect for a grief Geraldine apparently didn't share. And I put the phone down, not because I wasn't tempted to skip every careful step and just ask her to her face. I put it down because I've spent 11 years learning that the moment you confront a discrepancy before you've confirmed its full scope, you lose the ability to see how deep it actually goes. Dan filed a public records request with the county recorder's office for anything on file connected to the property, easements, liens, any recorded lease. Nothing showed up, which didn't surprise him. People who do this rarely record anything, he told me. Recording something makes it real in a way they don't want it to be. It's easier to just collect a check. What Dan found instead came from a subpoena to the rental platform itself, once we'd established, through the deed, that I was the legal owner disputing an unauthorized listing. It took 3 weeks. What came back was a full booking history, every reservation, every payout, going back to July, 2 years and 1 month before I found the listing. Total gross bookings, $41,600. After the platform's service fees, just over $38,000 in net deposits, paid out in regular installments to a checking account ending in 4,471. The account belonged to Geraldine Oakes. Alongside the booking history, the platform also produced, per Dan's request, a copy of something I hadn't expected, a signed property management agreement Geraldine had uploaded to verify her authority to list the cabin, required by the platform's policy for hosts managing property they don't personally reside at. It listed Geraldine as authorized property manager and carried a signature on the owner line reading David Oakes, dated 14 months after David had died. I sat in Dan's office holding that page, and I felt something in my chest that I want to describe accurately. Because anger isn't quite the right word, and I don't want to exaggerate it into something it wasn't. It was closer to the feeling of catching a dosing error on a chart. That cold, focused clarity that arrives right before you decide exactly what has to happen next. And in what order. "She signed his name," I said. Dan nodded slowly. "She signed a dead man's name to a document generating income for herself. I want to be careful here, Renee, because I know this is your husband's mother, and I know that matters to you even now. But you need to see this clearly before you decide what you want to do with it. This isn't a misunderstanding about who's allowed to use the cabin on weekends. This is forgery and furtherance of financial gain, on top of an unauthorized rental of property she has never held title to. Whatever you decide to do about the relationship, the legal exposure here is not small." I didn't cry in that office. I want to be honest that I came close. There's a particular kind of grief that comes back sideways, unannounced. When you realize someone has been quietly profiting off your husband's death for 2 years while you were still learning how to walk into a grocery store without dissolving at the sight of his favorite cereal. But I didn't let it happen there, and I'm not going to pretend that not crying made me feel strong. It just felt like something I needed to save for later, alone. Subscribe if you're the kind of person who documents everything before you say a single word out loud. I have a feeling you're going to want to see how this one lands. The next part of this story is the part I've thought the most about, because it's the part where I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be about this. Dan laid out, very plainly, what my legal options were. I could send Geraldine a cease and desist immediately, shutting the listing down within days. I could pursue restitution for the $38,000 through a civil claim, which Dan believed was strong given the forged signature and the platform's own records. I could, if I wanted to be aggressive about it, refer the forgery itself to the district attorney's office, since signing a deceased person's name to a document used to generate income for yourself sits well inside the definition of forgery in Oregon, particularly when paired with what's arguably a form of theft by deception. I told Dan I needed a week to think about what I actually wanted, separate from what I was legally entitled to. That week, I want to be honest, was the hardest part of this whole story. Harder in some ways than the discovery itself. I had 2 children who loved their grandmother. Lily was 9, Sam was 6. Neither of them had any idea what Geraldine had done, and some small, tired part of me wondered whether the kindest thing for them, if not for me, was to quietly shut the listing down through Dan's cease and desist, absorb the loss, and never speak of the $41,000 again. I sat with my mother on the phone one night, and even she, a woman who does not tend toward forgiveness on principle, said, "Renee, you don't have to burn the whole thing down to close it. You could just close it. I almost did that. I want you to know I almost took the quiet way out, the one where nobody's humiliated and nothing gets said out loud, and I just quietly reclaim what's mine, and let Geraldine keep whatever face-saving story she needs to tell herself about it." What changed my mind wasn't anger, it was Lily. About 4 days into that week of thinking, Lily came to me at bedtime and said, "Mom, can we go to the cabin this summer? Grandma said maybe we could all go together, like a family trip, before school starts." She said it so hopefully. She'd been asking to go back for over a year, and I'd always found a reason to put it off, because I still wasn't sure I could stand on that porch without falling apart. I asked her when Grandma had mentioned this, last weekend. She said she'd check the calendar and let us know which weekend works. I understood, sitting on the edge of my daughter's bed, exactly what Geraldine was doing. She wasn't simply renting out a dead man's cabin behind his widow's back. She was actively planning to coordinate a family vacation around her own rental calendar, checking which weekends were already booked to paying strangers before offering dates to her own grandchildren, so the family visit wouldn't interrupt the income. That was the moment the decision stopped being close for me. Not the $38,000, not even the forged signature, as ugly as that was. It was the fact that she was willing to schedule her grandchildren's grief around her side income. I called Dan the next morning and told him I wasn't interested in the quiet version anymore. Here's the part I need to be honest about, because it's the part people ask me about most when I tell this story. I did not want a screaming match. I have never once, in this entire ordeal, raised my voice at Geraldine Oaks, and I'm not going to start now describing it as if I did. If anything, everything I did in the weeks that followed, I did more quietly than usual. Tax season voice. No adjectives in it. The kind of flat, clear tone I use when I'm walking a nervous patient through a new diagnosis. Not cold, just precise. Because precision is its own kind of kindness when the truth is hard. I let Geraldine set the date for the family trip. She picked the second weekend in August. A weekend I would later confirm through the booking records that had also been listed as available on the rental platform up until 6 days before she offered it to me, at which point she'd simply blocked it off the calendar without canceling the standing listing. The way you'd hold a table at a restaurant without telling the kitchen you don't actually need it that night. Dan and I spent those weeks preparing, and I want to walk you through what that preparation actually looked like, because it wasn't dramatic, it was administrative. Dan compiled every document into a single binder: the deed, the will, the probate order confirming sole ownership, the forged property management agreement, the full booking history with all 31 reservations listed by date and dollar amount, and copies of the deposit records subpoenaed from Geraldine's bank, showing the funds landing in account 4,471 every month for 24 months running. He tabbed each section in the same blue plastic tabs he told me he'd used for 30 years of closings. And the smell of that office, old paper, the radiator ticking even in August heat, is something I'll associate with this whole ordeal for the rest of my life. He made 3 copies. One for me, one for his files, one that would, if needed, go to the county district attorney's office. I want to describe one particular evening from that preparation period, because it's the kind of moment people don't usually show you in stories like this, and I think it matters. 10 days before the trip, I sat at my kitchen table at 11 at night with the booking history spread out in front of me, cross-checking every date against my own calendar. Against the weekends I remembered staying away from the cabin out of respect for a grief I now understood Geraldine hadn't shared in the way I thought. I found the entry for the weekend of David's birthday, 7 months after he died. A family from Eugene had paid $380 to stay there. The same weekend I'd sat alone in my kitchen, unable to bring myself to drive out and see the place without him. I put my head down on my folded arms at that table and cried for the first time in weeks, not for the money, not even really for the betrayal, but for the particular cruelty of strangers laughing on David's dock on the one day of the year I'd been too broken to go there myself. I let myself have that 10 minutes. Then I got up, made tea, and kept sorting the pages, because the work still needed doing whether I'd cried or not. I want to tell you about a moment of weakness here, because I promised myself I'd be honest about this story, not just the parts that make me look composed. 2 nights before the trip, I sat at my kitchen table with that binder open in front of me, and I almost called it off entirely. I almost texted Geraldine and said the weekend didn't work after all, that we'd reschedule, that I'd handle this some smaller, more private way instead. A phone call, maybe, just the 2 of us, where she could explain herself without an audience. I sat there for almost an hour with my thumb over the message. What stopped me wasn't resolve. It was Dan's voice in my head from that first meeting. The moment you confront a discrepancy before you've confirmed its full scope, you lose the ability to see how deep it actually goes. I had already confirmed the scope. What I hadn't done yet was give her the chance, on her own terms, to make it right before it became something bigger than the 2 of us. So the next morning I called her, not to accuse her, to offer her an exit. Geraldine, I said, keeping my voice level, I need to talk to you about the cabin before this weekend. I know about the listing. I know about the last 2 years of reservations. I have the records. I let that sit for a moment, then said the part that mattered most. I'm not calling to ruin anything. I'm calling to give you the chance to shut it down yourself, quietly, before Saturday, and to talk to me privately about paying back what's owed. If you do that, this stays between us. There was a long silence on the line. Then Geraldine said, in a voice that had gone very thin, I don't know what you think you found, Renee, but I have been taking care of that property. Somebody had to. Taking care of it and renting it out under David's forged signature are 2 different things, I said. I'm not raising my voice about this, Geraldine. I'm asking you one time quietly to make this right before Saturday. She hung up on me. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment, and I felt, underneath everything else, a strange kind of sorrow. Not for what she'd done, but for the fact that she'd had a door held open for her and chosen to let it close. Tell me in the comments if you've ever offered someone a quiet way out and watched them walk past it anyway, because that's exactly what happened next. The family gathered at the cabin on a Saturday in the 2nd week of August. I want to describe the drive out, because I remember every mile of it with a strange, sharpened clarity. The way the highway narrows past Merlin, the smell of sun-warmed pine coming through the vents even with the windows up, the river flashing silver between the trees every few hundred yards like something signaling. Lily had her window down, one hand surfing the wind, telling Sam about the rope swing their dad used to push them on. I had the binder in a canvas tote on the passenger seat, tabs facing up, the way I'd organized it with Dan 2 nights before. When we pulled into the gravel driveway, there were already 4 cars there. Geraldine's sedan, Dana's SUV, David's sister, who I later learned had known about the rental for at least a year and had said nothing, which is its own kind of quiet complicity I'll get to. My mother-in-law's sister, Aunt Pat, visiting from Medford, and a 4th car I didn't recognize, a gray minivan with Sacramento plates. I knew before I got out of the car exactly what that 4th car meant. I want to be honest. My hands were not perfectly steady when I turned off the engine. That's the vulnerability I promised to admit to you. I sat there for maybe 10 seconds longer than I needed to, one hand on the door handle, feeling the old grief and the new anger sitting right on top of each other in my chest. And I thought about walking back out of that driveway and letting Dan handle every bit of it through the mail instead. I thought about it seriously. Then I thought about Lily in the back seat, already unbuckling, already reaching for the door, ready to run to a porch that was rightfully hers. And I got out of the car. The family from Sacramento, the Reyes family, I would learn, were standing at the top of the porch steps with 2 suitcases and a cooler, looking confused, and Geraldine was standing between them and the front door with a key ring in one hand and a clipboard in the other, her face arranged into the particular brightness she uses when she's trying to close a subject before it opens. "Renee," she said, too loudly, too quickly, "you're early. There's been a little scheduling mix-up. I'm sorting it out." Mr. Reyes, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, looked between us with the expression of someone realizing he's stepped into something much larger than a booking error. "We have a confirmed reservation," he said carefully, "through the rental site. $410, paid in full. Is there a problem?" I set the canvas tote down on the porch step, slow and deliberate, the way you set something down when you want a room to notice the weight of it. "There's no problem for you, Mr. Reyes," I said. My voice did not rise. If anything, I lowered it, the way I do at work when I have to tell a patient something serious and I want them to lean in rather than brace. "This is my cabin. I'm the sole legal owner and I never authorized this reservation or any of the 30 before it. I'll refund you myself, today, in full, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I need you to know this booking was never legitimate." The porch went silent except for the river moving behind the house and, somewhere across the water, a barred owl calling in broad daylight, the way it sometimes does when the light goes strange under heavy cloud cover. Geraldine's clipboard came down slowly to her side. "Renee, this isn't the time." "You're right," I said. "It's not the time you wanted, it's the time I chose." I opened the tote and lifted out the binder, and I want to describe the sound it made, because it's one of those small sensory details I'll never forget. The particular thick, dry sound of a heavy binder settling onto old porch boards, and underneath it, the deadbolt on the front door, which David had installed himself the summer before he died, making the good, solid click it always makes when the key ring in Geraldine's hand shifted against it. Dana stepped forward from where she'd been standing near the porch rail, arms crossed. "Renee, come on. Mom's been keeping the place up. Somebody had to. You weren't using it. I wasn't grieving fast enough for you." "You mean," I said, and I said it evenly, without heat, because it was simply true, and there was no reason to dress it up as anything else. "But this isn't about how fast I was ready to come back here. This is about a signature." I opened the binder to the tabbed page and turned it so it faced the porch. Facing Geraldine, facing the Reyes family, facing Aunt Pat, who had gone very still by the porch swing. "This is the property management agreement filed with the rental platform," I said. "It authorizes Geraldine Oakes to manage and rent this property. It's signed on the owner line, David Oakes, dated 14 months after David died." Nobody said anything. Mrs. Reyes had put a hand over her mouth. The river kept moving behind the house, indifferent, the way rivers are, and somewhere down near the water I could hear the rope swing David had hung from the big Douglas fir, knocking gently against the trunk in the breeze, a soft hollow sound that had nothing to do with any of this, and everything to do with it at the same time. Sam had gone very quiet beside me, one hand fisted in the hem of my shirt, and I remember thinking, in the middle of all of it, that I needed to keep my voice level for his sake, as much as for mine. "This," I continued, turning the next tabbed page, "is the full booking history for this property over the last 24 months. 31 reservations, $41,600 gross. This is the deposit history from account ending 4,471, showing that money landing in Geraldine's checking account every month for 2 years. Geraldine's face had gone the color of old dishwater. "You had no right to go digging through my finances." "I didn't dig through your finances, Geraldine," I said. And I want to note here, this is the part where I lowered my voice further instead of raising it, because the quieter I got, the more the porch seemed to lean toward me to hear. "A subpoena did that lawfully, because you rented out property that isn't yours using a signature that wasn't authorized on a document the rental platform is legally required to keep on file. I didn't invade your privacy. You created a paper trail the moment you forged my husband's name." That was the word that did it. Forged. I watched it land on her the way a diagnosis lands on someone who's been telling themselves for months that the symptom is nothing. Dana's arms uncrossed. Aunt Pat sat down slowly on the porch swing, as if her legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold her. "I was keeping it in the family," Geraldine said, and her voice had lost its brightness entirely now, gone thin and fast. "That money, David would have wanted the family to use that place. He would have wanted—" "David is not here to want anything," I said quietly. "That's exactly the problem. You signed his name because he isn't here to say no. I am, if this hit close to home. If you've ever watched someone use a person's death as an excuse to take something that was never theirs, Share this with someone who needs to hear that quiet doesn't mean weak. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it wasn't a clean, cinematic collapse. It was slower and sadder than that. Mr. Reyes asked carefully what he and his family should do, and I told them I'd refund their reservation in full within the hour, and that I was deeply sorry they'd been caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with them. Mrs. Reyes actually reached out and squeezed my arm on her way past, and said quietly, "For what it's worth, we always thought the host was a little strange about not wanting to meet in person." That detail, the fact that Geraldine had spent 2 years never once handling a check-in face-to-face, coordinating everything through a lockbox and a text message thread, told me more about how deliberate this had been than almost anything else in the binder. Once the Reyes family's car had pulled out of the driveway, it was just family left on that porch. Geraldine, Dana, Aunt Pat, my 2 children standing frozen by the porch steps with their overnight bags still in their hands, watching an adult version of a fight they didn't fully understand yet, and me. Dana Oakes is 38, David's older sister, a dental hygienist who lives 20 minutes away in Merlin with her husband and 2 teenagers. And I'd find out later through a conversation with Aunt Pat that happened weeks after that Saturday that Dana had known about the rental listing for at least a year before I did, that she'd stayed there herself twice with her own family under the guise of a family weekend, never once mentioning to me that the place was being run as a business on the side. I don't think Dana orchestrated any of it. I think she simply decided, the way people sometimes do, that it was easier to enjoy the benefit quietly than to ask the uncomfortable question of where her mother's sudden extra income was coming from. Dana was the one who finally spoke on that porch. "Mom, is this true? All of it?" Geraldine sat down hard on the porch swing next to Aunt Pat, the clipboard sliding off her lap onto the boards, and for a moment she looked less like the woman who'd hosted 83 strangers on my dock, and more like exactly what she was. A 67-year-old widow who had lost her husband, then her son, and had apparently decided somewhere along the way that a rental listing was easier to manage than her own grief. "I needed the money," she said finally, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way that, I'll admit, moved something in me even then. "After Walter died, I had nothing left but his pension and the house. Then David," she stopped, pressed a hand to her mouth. "I couldn't watch that place sit empty. Every weekend it sat there, empty. It felt like losing him twice. I thought if I kept it in use, kept people enjoying it, it would still feel like it mattered. And the money helped. God help me, it helped." I let that sit in the air for a moment, because I think it deserved a moment, even now. I do believe some of that was true. I believe grief made her do something that felt, to her, like preservation instead of theft. But I also believe that explaining a thing is not the same as excusing it. And I said so, gently, in the flattest, calmest voice I had. "I understand that losing Walter and then David broke something in you, Geraldine. I really do, but you didn't ask me. You didn't tell me. You signed a dead man's name on a legal document and collected $38,000 for 2 years while I stayed away from this place out of respect for a grief I didn't know you didn't share. And you were about to schedule your own grandchildren's visit around your rental calendar. That's not preservation. That's using David's memory as a cover story. Nobody on that porch argued with me. The aftermath, in the interest of being specific rather than dramatic, looked like this. Dan Alcott filed a civil demand within the week for the full $38,211 in net rental income, plus interest, and for the immediate and permanent removal of the listing, which Geraldine took down herself within 48 hours of that Saturday, before Dan's letter even arrived, which I took as the only honest thing she did in the entire process. She retained a lawyer of her own, a general practice attorney out of Medford, who reviewed the booking records and the forged agreement, and advised her, apparently in no uncertain terms, that fighting the claim in court would be both expensive and very likely to result in a referral to the district attorney's office for the forgery itself. Within 6 weeks, Geraldine agreed to a settlement, full repayment of $38,211, structured over 18 months, secured by a lien Dan filed against her house on Foothill Boulevard to guarantee the payments, recorded at the county courthouse the same week. I chose not to pursue the criminal forgery referral, and I want to be honest that this was the hardest decision of the whole process. Dan sat me down in his office one more time, this time without the binder open between us, and told me plainly that I had every right to make that call, and that most people in my position would go through with the referral without a second thought, especially given how clean the evidence was. He said something else too that stayed with me. "Renee, whatever you decide it because it's what you want, not because you're afraid of what people will say either way." I sat with that for 2 more days before I told him my answer. I decided against pursuing charges for one reason only. Lily and Sam still have a grandmother, and I decided that a recorded lien against her house and 18 months of monthly payments, publicly documented at the county courthouse for anyone who ever wanted to look, was accountability enough without also making her grandchildren watch her face criminal charges in a courtroom. That was my call to make, and I made it with a clear head, not a soft one, and I have not regretted it once, not even on the nights when the anger resurfaces on its own schedule, the way grief does. The cabin itself I've kept, and I've started, slowly, spending weekends there again. Just us, no strangers on the dock, no lockbox by the door. I had the locks changed the following week. A locksmith named Otis who drove out from town and worked in near silence. And I still remember the sound the new deadbolt made when he tested it for me. That good, solid click of something finally belonging only to the people it's supposed to. Lily asked me, about a month after that Saturday, whether Grandma Geraldine was still allowed to visit the cabin. And I told her yes, when she's invited, the same as anyone else. That's still true. Geraldine has been out twice since, both times by invitation, both times quieter than she used to be, both times helping without asking to run anything. As of this recording, she's made 11 of the 18 monthly payments on schedule, every one of them arriving on the first of the month like clockwork. The way I imagine a woman who spent 26 years teaching fourth graders about consequences would insist on paying a debt once she'd finally agreed it was hers to pay. I still think about Aunt Pat sitting on that porch swing the day everything came apart. The way her hands went still in her lap, the way she looked at her sister with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite pity, just a kind of tired recognition, as if she'd watched Geraldine make small compromises with the truth for years and had simply been waiting to see what they'd finally add up to. Aunt Pat drove home to Medford that same afternoon, and she called me 2 days later, not to take sides exactly, but to say, "Your mother-in-law has always believed that love that costs her nothing doesn't count as love at all." I think somewhere along the way she decided that applied to honesty too. I've turned that sentence over more times than I can count since then, because I think it's truer than she probably meant it to be. I've spent 11 years counting other people's pills, checking their doses against their weight and their history and every interaction that might hurt them without their knowing it. And if there's one thing that job has taught me, it's this. Nobody gets hurt by the medicine they can see. They get hurt by the thing they didn't know was in the bottle. Geraldine Oaks spent 2 years hoping I'd never read the label. Grief doesn't give anyone the right to forge a signature. And love that has to hide its receipts was never love. It was just very well-organized theft. If this story sat with you, drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.